So welcome to Secrets and the Supernatural, or as I like to call it, Secrets of the Supernatural. That's more interesting. I'm going to introduce some of our guests here. Okay, our first one is Olivie E. Blake. She's the New York Times best-selling author of the Atlas Six, Alone with You in the Ether, and One for My Enemy. As Alexine Farrell Fulmuth, she is also the author of the young adult rom-coms My Mechanical Romance and 12th Night. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband, Goblin Prince / toddler, and rescue pit bull. I assume those are two separate things, right? The toddler and the rescue pit bull. That'd be great if there were one.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it would be.
Her newest book is The Atlas Complex, which I just read is terrific. So let's hear it for Olivie E. M.L. Rio holds an M.A. in Shakespeare Studies from King's College London and Shakespeare's Globe, and a Ph.D. in English from the University of Maryland, College Park. Her best-selling first novel, If We Were Villains, has been published in 20 countries in 18 languages. Wow. Graveyard Shift is her first novella. So let's hear it for M.L. Margaret Killjoy is a storyteller who keeps audiences wrapped with her speculative fantasy and horror fiction and her radical history podcast, Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff. She has published the novellas The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion and The Barrow Will Send What It May with Tor.com, Escape from Incel Island, and short fiction collections including A Country of Ghosts and We Won't Be Here Tomorrow. The Sapling Cage, the first book in the Daughters of the Empty Throne trilogy, is forthcoming from Feminist Press in 2024. It's actually, I believe, out right now because I listened to it on Audible, right?
Yeah.
So it's out right now. So let's hear it. Margaret. We're going to start with a speed round, and we're going to have a series of short readings just to sort of get you in the mood of these books and give you a flavor of what these books are all about. And we're going to hear from Olivie first from the Atlas Complex.
Yes, okay. I guess you will not be following along, but it is page 10. When it came to the Alexandrian society, most people needed only 5 minutes to be convinced. But that was later Atlas's opinion. At the time, Atlas was heartsick and overqualified. In the larger scheme of things, he was bored. He would come to understand over time that most people were bored, especially those in consideration for a place in the society. It was a small, gentle cruelty of life that most people with a true sense of purpose lacked the talent to achieve it. The people with talent are far more likely directionless, an odd but unavoidable irony. In Atlas Blakely's experience, the best method for ruining someone's life is to give them exactly what they want and then politely get out of their way. The cipher led him to the toilet of a 16th century chapel, which led him to the roof of a recently completed skyscraper, which led him to a field of sheep. Eventually he arrived at the Alexandrian Society's municipal quarters, an older version of the room in which he would later meet 6 of his own recruits. A forthcoming renovation, which Atlas would not know until later, was funded by someone who was not even in the society, who had never been initiated, had probably never killed someone ever, which was very nice for the donor in question. Presumably they slept very well at night, but that's obviously not the point. So what is the point? The point is a man, a genius named Dr. Blakely, had an affair with one of his first-year undergraduates in the late 1970s that resulted in a child. The point is there are inadequate resources for mental health. The point is schizophrenia is latent until it isn't, until it ripens and blooms, until you look down at the infant who ruined your life and understand both that you would willingly die for him and also that you will probably die for him whether the decision is left in your hands or not. The point is nobody will call it abuse because it is, by all accounts, consensual. The point is there is nothing to be done except to wonder if things might have been different had she not worn that skirt or looked at her professor that way. The point is a man's career is at stake, his livelihood, his family. The point is Atlas Blakely will be 3 years old when he first hears the voices in his own mother's head. The duality of her being, the way her genius splinters off somewhere, dovetailing into something darker than either of them understand. The point is the condom broke, or maybe there was no condom. The point is there are no villains in this story, or maybe there are no heroes. The point is, someone offers Atlas Blakely power, and Atlas Blakely says, unequivocally, yes.
All right. The Atlas Complex. Okay. Margaret Killjoy, let's hear from the Sapling Cage.
When a witch I didn't recognize came into the tent and cleared her throat, I sat bolt upright in bed. The sun wasn't even out yet. I wasn't sure what I'd actually heard the night before and what I'd dreamed. There had been chanting and singing, fox cries, all night, fox cries. What does a covenant get up to at night once its whelps are asleep? We will meet in the clearing today, the witch said, and then turned and walked into the darkness outside. I hadn't been able to see her face under the hood, and it was a bit like I'd dreamed her. The morning was cold, and I lingered a moment with a wool blanket around my shoulders before I got up, slipped on my boots and cloak, and followed the rest of the whelps into the morning. We met by the ashes of the bonfire, the grove lit now by a triangle of braziers, 3 to a side. Each of the 3 sides glowed a different hue, one red, one blue, one purple. As I walked past, I realized each fire was cold, and each fire burned no fuel.
That's the Sapling Cage. And now, ML?
Edie would not go away. Tuck had tried to kill the conversation, something he usually managed to do without trying, but she was perfectly capable of playing both parts herself, mostly posing rhetorical questions, thinking out loud, unable to leave the mystery of the whole unresolved. She chattered at him as she crossed the churchyard, still moving insistently towards the anchorite. "Must be really hurting for news, huh?" he asked, risking outright rudeness in the hopes that she would finally relent, lose interest, and leave. Unlike the rest of them, he had nowhere to be and nowhere to go and was justifiably protective of the building. He'd been rationing his cigarettes, but under the circumstances considered another one justified. A fourth would be flirting with extravagance. He felt around in his pockets for the pack, tripping over his own feet in his haste to catch up to her. She had a surprisingly long stride, weaving between headstones and weeping angels like it was some sort of nocturnal steeplechase. "That obvious, huh?" she said, undeterred. Everybody's lost interest in the hostile incidents. He could hear the capital letters. Wondered if she'd coined the term herself or simply gave it her editorial stamp of approval. "There's not much else happening around here, except this." She gestured over her shoulder at the hole.
That's great. Okay, my first question is for all of you, and it's a little bit of a long question. You can jump in where you see fit. It'll make sense by the end, this question. So I'm in Starbucks the other day, and I hear Michael Jackson come on the speaker. And I see a kid and little kid and their parent, they're dancing along to it. And I'm thinking to myself, geez, so Michael Jackson, he's so good, he can't be canceled. People just love him anyways. And I was thinking, all of your books in some way kind of challenge fantasy tropes and supernatural tropes in some really foundational way. I mean, with the Atlas Complex, it's such a diverse, incredibly diverse cast. I mean, that's something we didn't see in fantasy really previously to the last few years or so. And the Sapling Cage, I mean, the whole point, I think, sort of completely undercuts the traditional heroic arc you see of, like in Mulan, where a woman is dressing up like a man. Instead, this is someone who's a girl who the world sees as a boy who wants to be a witch, and it's fascinating to sort of follow her journey of discovery. And the graveyard shift, I think, also all the characters kind of because of their flaws and their issues, they kind of undermine again the traditional notions of what heroes, who your protagonist is supposed to be. So, given all that, given the fact that all of you, I think, seem to have an affection for some of the fantasy and supernatural literature of the past, can you enjoy the stuff of the past, or are you just out to destroy it? I mean, do you go through and read Tolkien and Stephen King and go, I love this, or are you like, oh my gosh, my next book is going to really undermine what they've done because I can't connect to it anymore? What's your thinking about the past, the authors of the past that you maybe liked when you were a kid, but now you're out to sort of lay new ground? Anyone can jump in.
Well, I got a PhD in old stuff, so I did fully spend 7 years of my life doing that, and you have to kind of negotiate with the past in terms of what you choose to lionize and what you decide is maybe best left for dead. So I think engaging with literature of the past gives us some interesting opportunities to kind of take something that does have value and is a classic for a reason, but update it for a contemporary readership.
I think my work is constantly in conversation with the past. Like, if we were villains and the Atlas Six are both in conversation with the secret history. But we're also, like, I can only write from where I am. And when I'm writing, it's a mirror of what I'm going through. And the Atlas series is very much a criticism of capitalism and the structures that we have. Even though it's a fantasy, it's crossover sci-fi, it's still a capitalist system. Magic is something that has been exploited, and exploitation is built into the system. So really, I just want to say that the tagline on this is "Power is taken," but I wanted it to be "Power is a body count." My publisher said no, but I think it's always an evolving conversation. I think all of literature is we're trained on the canon, right? And that gives us the freedom to say something new, but always with that being there.
I feel like some of those people I'm really glad are dead, but some of those people I really miss. I'm on a William Morris kick right now because he invented wallpaper and fantasy fiction and was like a socialist who tried to get all the other socialists to stop fighting each other. And he was writing in the 19th century, and like, do his works stand up exactly now? No. Are they weirdly queer because they're from before the 20th century? Yes. And also I have long, complex thoughts about Tolkien, but my black metal band is named after his work, so I would be a liar to claim that I am not taking some inspiration from him.
A Feminazgul, right?
Yes.
I love that band name. Isn't that a great name? Feminazgul. Love that. The other question I have is, all of your books have this conversation going on with the academic community. I mean, in the Atlas series, people are going through an education, and a difficult one, which results in a body count. In the Sapling Cage, of course, learning to become witches. And of course, in Graveyard Shifter, the whole narrative revolves around an academic setting. My question is, did you do this, or do you have a fascination with academia because you love it, or because you met a teacher that maybe you want to get back at? You know, what is your relationship really to the academic community, and why are your books connected to that community? You can all jump in.
I feel guilty about it because I'm an art out with no formal education beyond that, and so I try to fight to not have everyone just like hate academia in all of my books. But so I write about very informal educational systems, but then I also have been like, I really like writing complex societies where both formal and informal educational systems are able to interweave, and I'm really excited about doing more of that. That's my weird, I swear I don't hate academia anymore. I'm getting over it.
I'm a law school dropout, so we have that. Hey! And I think, for me, it's a love, but it's a complicated love. Academia is still an institution. It still exists to prop itself up. It has its own interests. One of the important things in the Atlas series is that there are separate agendas. There is, like, eventually by the end of the trilogy, you realize there is the agenda of the Atlas Blakely, whose passage I just read. There's the agenda of the archives that are sort of sentient. And then there's the agenda of the Alexandrian society, which just wants to contribute back to its own wealth and power. And that is definitely based on, actually that's based very closely on my time working in university admissions. So, you know, it's this, of course, you can love something and still criticize it. And for me, I love, what I really wanted, especially in the Atlas 6, was that feeling of when you're in the classroom and you can feel your mindset being rewritten, you can feel yourself changing, like all these new ideas. And of course, that is a beautiful thing. And the smartest people that I've known have been people who've been in the classroom with me. But the system itself is flawed.
Yeah, what both of them said. I wish I had dropped out of my PhD program. My cohort jokingly calls me Dr. Don't Do It. The joke is I spent 7 years getting a PhD so I could spend the rest of my life telling people not to get a PhD. So if you need to be talked out of graduate school, see me after class. Yeah, I mean, I gave 12 years of my life to higher education, and those are 12 years that I occasionally think of fondly, and I occasionally sit there and stare at the wall and go, those are 12 years I'm never getting back. Yeah, academia is funny. It's a thing that sort of demands total self-sacrifice, and it will chew you up and spit you out and not love you back. And part of what I think all of us have engaged with as a theme in our work is that exact quality of expecting this total devotion and then absolutely brutalizing you for it. And that ties very closely with what you're talking about with capitalism, because especially in the United States where we've privatized higher education, you cannot separate those things. And so that was something I wanted to look at a little more closely with Graveyard Shift. Villains is much more about the intellectual side of the exercise, and Graveyard is a little more interested in research ethics and that kind of thing, and how capitalism influences the production of knowledge, because that's a whole minefield.
Do you think that academia, just to preface, I was talking to my editor about who would finish my manuscripts if I died while they were in progress, and I asked if you could please write them, because I think you grasp my sense of character, but do you think that's because we spent too much time in academia? Like, do we just see humanity as crap? Is that the problem?
Oh, I don't know. I think just, let's call it trauma bonding.
Okay.
Let's call it long-distance trauma bonding, as we've both survived that somehow, so we speak the same language.
I also thought you could handle the morbidity of that exercise, of engaging with my ghost.
I will engage with your ghost any day of the week.
By the way, we're going to have time for questions from all of you at the end of all this, so get those questions ready, so we'll pause for that at the end of the panel. And one other thing, most of all these books just came out, so I'm going to try to ask questions that don't reveal stuff that that gives away endings to things, because you probably haven't read them yet, though you should have, because they're out. They came out this week, some of them. So, but if you haven't, I'm not going to spoil anything. And if you feel me about to spoil something, we'll have a safe word, maybe Octavia Butler. Just say that. And
I thought it was already. Excuse me.
Okay. Yeah.
That's a long safe word. That's risky.
So I have a question about the Atlas series.
Yes.
One thing that I love about the series is the fact that initially publishers didn't embrace it. And you self-published, got it out there, became a huge bestseller, become a trilogy, become a whole thing. Tell me, what did those publishers say at the beginning to you, saying, what were their excuses for not wanting to publish it, and have any come and apologize to you later?
So actually, okay, so I never queried the Atlas 6. I, at that point, had already, many things had died on the querying floor. And so I just kind of got the feeling that I couldn't pitch the Atlas 6 in a way that an agent would be interested in, just because the pitch, you could pitch it a bunch of very familiar ways, but to me what was interesting about it was the 6 unreliable narrators, the way that there is no objective story, there's no objective truth, that you as the reader, when you finish a character's point of view, think one thing, and then another, you see the other character's perspective and maybe make up your mind about what actually happened. So I actually don't know whether publishing would have accepted it or not. I have a sense that it would have been hard to get an agent for the Atlas 6, but I don't know that for a fact. But it was my 9th self-published book. So at that point I was like, you know what? Publishing is maybe not interested in what I have to say. Maybe what I'm doing with characters is not relatable enough. I'm having trouble getting through the gatekeepers. So which is why I have to speak very, fondly about Book Talk. I think that TikTok has a problematic algorithm that prioritizes pretty, white, thin faces. But Book Talk generally is just word of mouth. And so sometimes I feel that publishing as an industry doesn't realize, it's not keeping up with what publishing the market actually is, that how diverse the market actually is. Publishing the machine doesn't understand that yet, and Book Talk pushed it there to some extent. I don't think it's 100% a perfect system, but certainly I benefited a lot from the Atlas 6, and that people were drawn to it because of the type of storytelling it was that didn't feel conventional, and I appreciate that.
Well, Margaret, I have a question about your book, which I think is fantastic. I'm always interested in world building, because I know great supernatural writing, great fantasy writing isn't always about being able to construct a sentence, it's about being able to build a world and have people inhabit it. And your world's a very complex one of witches and knights, and they have various positions relative to one another. How did you go about building that world? I mean, did you sketch it out first and then start writing? Did you start writing and the world came to you as you began to pursue it? How does that work to build a world?
Well, everyone else has talked trash on capitalism, and I haven't yet. So one of the things that I try very consciously to do with my writing is I get really annoyed that we can imagine all these fantastical monsters and magical systems, but we can't imagine that societies could function differently, and not even imagine perfect utopian. I actually did that in a different book, but just literally hey, this town could run differently than what we imagine medieval England ran like, which is somehow what D&D is or whatever, you know? And so I really like exploring all of these different ways that societies can work. And rather than have it just be like, oh, there's like one big society and everything's the same, that doesn't really reflect the real world at all. And so what I do, I don't map out my entire world and then start writing it, much to my publisher's consternation, who's trying to get me to draw a map of the country. But for me, I have to outline the plot of the book. I've learned that. This is not my first book, and eventually I was like, okay, if I'm going to write at the rate I need to outline my book. And that gets rid of a lot of the organic growth and fun of writing for me. And so allowing myself to do that with world building is the sort of joy of it. I give myself these little seeds, and then I see where they go. I'll like mention something in passing, and then if I manage to tie it in by the end of the book, then I'll keep it in, and if I don't, I sometimes take it out from the beginning. And yeah, I really like growing the worlds organically, and have a really hard time doing the world building thing, which is a terrible thing, because I do role-playing game stuff, and now I have to write fiction in a role-playing game world I wrote, which means I wrote the encyclopedia of my world, and now I have to write fiction. Anyway, whatever.
So, I have a confession to make. So whenever I do panels like this and you have to read a lot of books before, sometimes I'll listen to about like 2.5 or so on Audible to sort of get through them. But when I was listening to your book, 'cause I got it early on a manuscript version, I listened to it on Speechify, and the setup was so arresting. I mean, I'm not going to give anything away here, but just the fact that they're in this deconsecrated church, they're in this graveyard. Suddenly, this group of people, they're all grouping together and bonding over smoking, and they see someone digging a grave in a graveyard that shouldn't be any more graves being dug. And immediately, I'm like, I got to go down to one. I got to listen to this. I was just drawn into it, like the best of Stephen King. Tell me a bit about how that whole image, that whole opening scene came to you.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. That's very high praise, and I think a lot of credit is due to our audiobook readers, who are just fantastic. But yeah, so I'm actually not a fantasy writer, and all of my world building is kind of real world anchored. And this book came from a couple of things, one of which is my very real life experience with very severe insomnia. So that comes from a close to home sort of place. But this came from when I was an undergrad. There was this bizarre smoking policy on my campus, which was that you couldn't smoke within 100 feet of any campus building. And because the entire town was basically the campus, that meant that you basically couldn't smoke anywhere. Except there were these two little pockets on campus where people somehow figured out that you were technically 100 feet from any campus building. One was a flagpole on the North Quad, so you would see all these like sad, miserable people like huddled around this flagpole. And the other was this funny little graveyard that was behind my dorm. And that was a place where I used to just hang out, because that's the kind of a person I am, I suppose. And late at night, I used to, again, because I just couldn't sleep, I would go wander through the graveyard, and I would occasionally see people just kind of standing in the graveyard, having a cigarette in the middle of the night, and got to talking to some of them just because, you know, it's alienating to be someone who can't sleep when everyone else is sleeping. Your days are much longer, you spend a lot of time alone. And if you find yourself in those kind of weird midnight hours running into other people, you naturally sort of start talking to each other. And it's a pretty thin thing to hang a friendship on, just a shared bad habit. So I had a lot of fun with the world building in this book, of sort of letting these characters get to know each other better as the story progresses, because suddenly they have a real problem to solve. But as for the actual sort of premise of the book, a lot of that came from, I'm a very lapsed Catholic, and I was, subjected to a lot of very dark Gothic trappings from a very young age, and I was very into, speaking of our favorite old books, I read a lot of kind of Victorian Gothic fiction when I was in middle and high school, and was very interested in all of these stories about body snatchers and, Jekyll and Hyde, these kind of early science fiction experiments with the place between life and death, and with anatomy, and all these sciences that are relatively new. And then in my PhD, I kind of landed in the medical humanities, where I do a lot of work on how science and literature intersect. So all these things sort of came together as I was thinking about, why not put a new grave in this graveyard where there shouldn't be one, and figure out what's there and why.
great. That's great. So the other thing I was thinking about that connects all of your books is music. I mean, there's a great scene in your book where there's an execution set or a defense and a series of executions set to Sam Cooke.
Yeah.
I could see that on the big screen or the small screen or wherever it ends up, just playing out. It's very cinematic. Of course, Margaret, you've mentioned that you play actually in bands, so music is part of your life. And ML, I know you write about music quite regularly.
There's a playlist in this book. It's really cool.
And that's part of what I want to get into. Is, I want to know what role music plays in your writing life, and also, is there a song or an artist that best represents your current book that you could want to tell the public out there?
It was that ringtone right there. That's the sound that you hear in my brain when I'm trying to write.
Anyone can jump in with that.
I can dive into that one because I do some work as a music writer, which doesn't mean that I write music because I have no actual musical talent. I write about music, so I do a lot of reviews and artist interviews. Music is really kind of the point zero for my writing process. Unlike I think both of you, I am a really thorough outliner, like once an academic, always an academic. You can try and get out, but it stays with you. So my writing process actually starts with me just kind of dumping music into a playlist that I'm just like, these are the vibes. And then I listen to that playlist obsessively, and it kind of grows and mutates off itself while I'm sort of mucking around in the story space and figuring out what's actually going to happen here. So I tend to also weave music through my books just because it's such an essential part of my writing process. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. My next novel, which is coming out about this time next year, is all about music in a really big way, so I'm looking forward to doing that. But I also find that like when I'm struggling to get through something creatively, turning to another form of art is the easiest way to kind of get out of that block, is to get inspired by something amazing that someone else is doing. And I'm just a very aural person. I'm not super visual, I don't watch a lot of TV, but I do really listen to music, and I listen to a lot of vinyl, and I like that kind of tactile relationship with it. So yeah, it's a big part of everything that I do, really.
I write in silence, which is funny because I play music all the time. But I don't like background music. It doesn't work for me. The same as like you can't watch a movie with me because if you start talking, I pause the movie, and then I like look at you, and then you're like, no, and then I'm like, no, I'm gonna pay attention to you. I can only listen to one thing at a time. And so when I'm writing, I'm listening to myself write, I guess. And with the exception of, I once got to write this like trashy heterosexual romance novel, like ghostwrite it, and I had 3 weeks because the whole thing seemed like a scam, so I waited for the check to clear. And then the check cleared, and I was like, I only have 3 weeks left. What the fuck am I gonna do? And they sent me the playlist of what to get into the guy's head, and as soon as I came out as trans, I had to write male point of view or whatever. Anyway, and it was all pop country, and like, no offense to pop country, and I live in West Virginia, but I'm like, I no. And so I just put on Dope Smoker by Sleep, which is 53 minutes long of this like stoner metal to obliterate your brain. I don't even do drugs. And I would keep track of how long I was writing, but I was like, oh, I wrote for 7 dope smokers today. And I wrote the book in 3 weeks. And so that's, I can always do that if I like really need, but no, I like writing in silence. And then if I were to pick musicians, if someone made the movie of the Sapling Cage, I would want Lankum, an Irish band, to do the soundtrack for it.
I find the Sex Pistols are good for that too, if you really need to just like slam through something with zero finesse.
Which is what happens in that book. Yeah.
Oh God, Octavia Butler. I need an adult.
I also write in silence because if there's music playing, I might accidentally transcribe the lyrics instead of what I'm trying to say. But it's important for me to get into the headspace, especially like I like to have multiple projects going on at the same time. So in order to tap back into wherever I was, I will play like a particular song or whatever. But sometimes you just need to enter the fugue state. So you just have to get into the transportive place where you're not in your body. And so it's like the same song over and over. Most recently, I'm writing a Gothic, or I was working on a Gothic this summer. and I listened to, oh my gosh, what is it? From the new Glass Animals album. And I listened to the same song over and over for like 2 hours, because I was just like, I cannot leave where my brain is right now. And that tends to happen for me in anything that involves choreography. So a fight scene and a sex scene, I cannot leave the headspace. So yeah, those two are the things. But it is kind of that, like, we're just gonna get it down and then we'll finesse it later. But for right now, we cannot leave Glass Animals. Oh, but for this, it would be The Best by AWOL Nation.
Oh, I think I forgot to actually mention what the music for this would be. There is a playlist in the back of the book. It's on Spotify now, because my publisher didn't want that. I wanted that, so I was like, I'm going to force my music taste on all of you. It's a lot of 80s alternative, but if I had to pick one, I think it would be Concrete Blonde has this great album called The Vampire Song, Bloodletting, which is very fitting for Graveyard Shift.
Yeah, I have a public Spotify, and all of my books have playlists.
You know, one thing I find fascinating about all your books, too, is that, of course, this is the end of a trilogy. That's the beginning of a trilogy. Your book is a novella, so maybe it could be a trilogy. Who knows? You know, who knows where it could go or what you're doing next?
It's a little standalone Scooby snack.
Yeah, but what I find fascinating, because I'm actually sort of fascinated by George R. R. Martin's sort of struggle with finishing The Winds of Winter and finishing up his long-awaited.
I have a rumor about this. Do you want to hear my rumor that I've heard?
Please, let's pass along the rumor.
I literally do not know how much truth there is to this, but I've accepted it as true. That another author who works with George R. R. Martin said that he actually has finished it, but he's waiting until the publisher sues him for not delivering it, because in his mind, this is a lose-lose situation, that if he finishes it while he's alive, then people will hate it regardless of what he does. So he's waiting to either die or get sued. And I have I don't know, I have no idea how true that is, but I've accepted it as true. Like, I love that rumor.
Legendary if true.
I'm not mad at that man.
Fiction, we're going to pass on some of these rumors.
I'm not mad at him at all.
But here's the question. I mean, it's so difficult, especially with your book, with so many point of view characters, so many big themes. You know, you've got magic, you've got nuclear explosions. There's a lot going on. At some point, do you feel overwhelmed by all the themes you're trying to bring in for a landing? Or with the Sapling Cage, do you feel overwhelmed with the huge world you're beginning to evoke? And with your book, was it difficult to fit in all these characters into such a slim volume and make it make sense and make sure all their character arcs came to successful conclusions? Can you talk a bit about that, about really taking hold of the complexity that comes with writing a multi-book story?
There is nothing so wonderful and freeing as book one of a trilogy. You can do anything. You have so much power. Everyone's so excited. And then you get middle book, and people are like, well, I guess it's a middle book. And then you get the ending, and people are mad at the ending. And it's just like, don't do it. Just stop here.
My publisher is in the audience. So.
She will not be delivering. I think for me, because I don't outline, I'm a discovery writer. I need to discover. If I try to tell myself what the story is, my brain is going to fight back. And what I did know when I started the Atlas 6 was, like I said, I knew what the form was. I knew about the unreliable narrators. I knew I was going to play with scope. That book 2 and book 3, I was following what I called the, oh no, it's escaping me. The Westworld, there it is, Westworld model. That was just like the first season is so enclosed that you don't necessarily question the ethics of the world that you're in. Like you do, you know it's problematic, but not really. You just kind of buy in, this is the world. And I wanted the audience to really sit with that feeling of like, oh, this is the world, what can we do about it? A person has to die, oh well, because that's what I wanted you to buy into with the system. And so then moving, zooming back out to see how that happened and applying it to real world context, that was a really important part of the exercise of looking at the ethics of this world and, in that sense, our world. And so I knew that the ending, I knew a character was going to die, but I didn't know who. I knew that the ending was going to be a place of catharsis, that the ending was definitely not a happily ever after, also not necessarily a tragedy. It's a tragedy in the sense that everything could be prevented, that it's like the tragedy is internal, that like you from the outside can see the ways that it didn't have to happen, and that's what makes it so tragic. But to also have this feeling that like The way that the book Piranesi made me feel, that just the ending was like, oh, like there's something really beautiful here. Like there is a beautiful feeling in this story. And so I wanted that, and it to be like sort of exquisitely torturous as you get there. I don't know if I achieved that, but I did my best.
All my previous books are novellas because I tend to write short just by default, and this has been, well, besides the romance novels, but and so this has been an interesting experiment. And frankly, I know how it sounds like writers are like, oh, our job is so hard, or whatever, but like it is the hardest thing I have done in any art form that I've tried, and I've done a lot of them, is to hold together an entire plot of an entire novel in my head with all the characters doing all of their things. And maybe it's because I tend to have like kind of monofocus, right? And so sometimes having all of these different intersecting plot lines going on at the same time, I believe I'm reasonably good at it, but it took a really long time, and it is still incredibly hard. I often am just like what's happening in your book? And I don't remember. And I'm just like in the fog where there's the forward and the backward, and unfortunately that's the nice thing is that you get to edit, so you can just like write it and then be like, oh, that's the part that didn't work, and go back and fix it. But I forget that because I tend to sort of, the whole point of finishing something is you get to start the new thing. Like that's like how you actually get anything done, is you have to finish things. But so you just have to, you don't get to eat the carrot until you get to the whatever.
Trilogies are hard though because you're a different person by the time the third book comes out. Like I had a conversation with Ara Kwong once about how like the difficult thing about the Poppy War is that she was just completely like her interests were just completely elsewhere by book 3, and I felt the same way about writing the Atlas series. It was just like I had started with one concept, but with the way politics were changing and everything that was going on in the context I existed, I have an Iranian character, and I was following everything about the morality police, and I was just like, this isn't my story to tell, but I can't like not, like this has to factor into who this character is. And so like the hard thing about trying to carry a story on for that long is also that like actual linear time gets in the way.
Yeah, I feel like I'm gonna come off here as like the hard-ass teacher in the room of like, I actually love to outline and I actually love to revise. I really enjoy structure. I really enjoy structure and form. And again, I think I'm a dyed-in-the-wool academic, unfortunately. So I did actually have a problem. My poor agent is going to be like having war flashbacks about this, but I did have a problem while I was actually in my graduate program that every novel I wrote came out reading like a textbook. And she was like, it's too much fact, it's too much information, like you gotta get back into the feeling of the thing. But I have the opposite problem that you have, where I tend to overwrite. Everything I write is way too long in the first draft, and I like know that about myself. And so when my publisher approached me about doing a novella, it wasn't my idea, so you can blame them if you're mad about the fact that it's a novella, which many of our reviewers have been, which is fun. I knew that was going to be a challenge going in. I was kind of like, okay, I have two challenges here. One is I'm a chronic overwriter, and you could replace that with overachiever and you wouldn't be wrong. The other problem is I'm an ensemble writer. I never write a book that has only one main character. I always need to have a group or I get bored. So it was a real challenge figuring out how do you make 5 personalities come through forcefully in a book that's only 120 pages. So that was a real challenge, but the form I kind of landed on was I really wanted it to feel like a relay, where each character kind of hands it off to the next person at the end of their chapter, and it's like, okay, now it's your turn to take this baton and figure out the next little tidbit of this mystery. And doing that, I think, kind of gave them each some time to shine. But I also chose to introduce them all, and I actually also did this in Villains, I'm realizing right now, out loud. The way I chose to introduce them all was to just throw them all together and let them have a conversation, because I really enjoy writing dialogue, is really my favorite thing, because a dialogue speaks for a character in more than one way, because the way somebody says something can be just as important as the content of what they're saying. If you have a basic story like, I would have been on time, but I got a flat tire, you pick 5 people in this room and they're all gonna tell that story in a different way. So that was kind of an exercise for me to figure out what do the voices of these characters actually sound like. and how do we differentiate these characters through their voices. And then we got really lucky with the audiobook where we had this great multicast narration where we had a bunch of actors bringing these characters to life. So hopefully that comes through and you can keep track of everyone, but if not, that's fair. I tried.
Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.